Happy Friday, everyone. I am Kelly O'Neill. I am the director of the Davis Center's Imperior Project. We are at Harvard University, and this is Degrees, Minutes, Seconds. This is my opportunity to spend a few minutes every week telling you some kind of crazy story that kind of brings to light the importance that maps have played throughout history and the importance that spatial thinking plays in the present. Today, for the last few weeks, actually, the last 4 episodes, we have been talking about the Black Sea. And we have talked about some beautiful things: orchards, gardens, vineyards, mountain streams flowing down to the coast. We've also talked about some of the more problematic, dangerous elements of the Black Sea environment. We have talked about marshlands and reeds and rapids and shoals and sandbars and islands and snakes that, according to rumors, had the capacity to devour men whole. The Black Sea was known as a relatively inhospitable place for much of its history. In fact, for almost all of its history. The ancient Greeks literally called it the inhospitable sea. It was known for all kinds of perils and dangers, primarily storms, horrible currents, horrible winds, terrible storms that led to shipwreck. And the coasts of the Black Sea were known to be littered with the wrecks of ships lying just below the surface. One menace that is less frequently associated with the Black Sea is ice. Ice is something, icebergs, ice flows, this is something that is generally associated in the minds of most mariners anyway, with places further north, right? With Arctic conditions and with Antarctic places. It isn't necessarily the first thing someone thinks of when assembling a list of the menace of navigating the Black Sea. But one day, maybe about a year ago, when I was trolling through the library looking for a good 20th century map of the Black Sea, I stumbled across a map called an ice chart of the Black Sea. And it wasn't just one chart, there were 6 charts. There was one chart per month for November, December, January, February, March, and April of 1942. And the charts themselves were published in 1946. And they're beautiful. They are, I posted one to the Instagram account. You can have a look if you like. They're gorgeous, relatively simple, very modern style charts. And they showcase on a background of kind of dark cream with a lovely regular coordinate grid laid over it. They chart the presence of ice in the northern coast, mainly the northern part of the Black Sea and the Sea of Azov. And my eyes kind of lingered on the maps for a little bit. They're just beautiful, and they were really interesting, and it caused me to pause and think about the history of ice on the Black Sea. And then I realized, as sometimes happens when your mind is used to reading one language, it takes you a minute to process that this map wasn't in Russian. I'm looking at Russian maps of the Black Sea. The map was in English. And I dug around a little bit and realized the map was published by the United States Navy. It was published by the Hydrographic Office of the U.S. Navy in 1946. And as a historian of Russia, I will confess that my knowledge of the inner workings of the U.S. Navy is incomplete and imperfect. And so I had to go and do some digging because I just didn't know what the Hydrographic Office was normally up to and why it was creating an ice chart of the Black Sea at the end of World War II. So let me tell you a little bit about what I found out, because I think it's actually quite interesting. So the Hydrographic Office of the U.S. Navy has a history that goes back to 1830, when the Depot of Charts and Instruments was established within the U.S. Navy. About a decade later, in 1842, along came a commander of this depot named Lieutenant Matthew Fontaine Maury. And he was quite an innovator and quite had a kind of an appetite for data. He wanted to create a system for collecting information from all over the globe, information about navigation conditions from all over the globe in relatively short order. So he suggested that all shipmasters flying any kind of US flag should be required or strongly recommended to report to a central agency. And that agency, which would become the Hydrographic Office, would digest and compile and distribute all of this data. I mean, it sounds like something we would talk about in the 21st century, right? This is Lieutenant Maury proposing the ultimate global navigational crowdsourcing project, right, in 1842. So astonishingly, over the course of the next 5 years, 26 million reports were received at the Depot of Charts and Instruments. So think about the flow of information that we're seeing in the middle of the 19th century, right? So in 1866, the Depot of Charts and Instruments formally became the Hydrographic Office of the U.S. Navy. And just so that you know, it existed until 1962, so almost exactly 1 century. In 1962, it would be replaced by the Naval Oceanographic Office, which exists to this day. So the Hydrographic Office is out there trying to crowdsource and digest and compile and tame an astonishing amount of navigational data, right? They're not the only act in town, right? The British Admiralty, quite famously, is the most reliable and comprehensive source of navigational charts in the world. And they're not the only act in town either. The Russian Navy also has a hydrographic office. And in the 1860s, actually, it begins paying attention to ice flows and compiling data about the freezing and thawing of ice, particularly on rivers. But in 1888, the Russian Hydrographic Office, the Russian Admiralty, began to collect systematically information about the freezing and thawing of seacoasts in the Russian Empire. And so it compiled, imagine yourself, wanting to do this kind of project in the 1880s, early 1890s. How do you go about collecting that kind of information? Well, the Russian Admiralty came up with another novel idea for data collection. If Maury had the crowdsourcing thing, the Russian Admiralty puts a spin on it, and we'll call it the lighthouse method. Okay, so the Russian Admiralty decides to put together a blank form, with a questionnaire, essentially with a series of 6 questions about ice. Like, when did it appear? Do you know where it came from? When did it go away? How thick was it? Could you crack it easily? Did it constitute a threat to a ship? They just created this blank questionnaire, made thousands of copies of them, and distributed them to every observation station and lighthouse on the Empire's coasts, with instructions that the poor guys manning those stations and coasts fill in those questionnaires on a monthly basis and submit them to the Admiralty. So it's kind of simple, right? But the kind of thing that could succeed. But it turns out, despite the simple nature of the form, the information return received by the Admiralty was pretty poor and inconsistent. The data was compiled only for 5 years. Standards of data collection had not really been established. And the Russian Admiralty decided to collate all of this information into a publication, and they published all of it in 1893. So you get this incredible digest of every time, on the Black Sea coast, for example, that ice appears. Someone's, manning a lighthouse writes down that, ice has appeared, and then it melts away 3 days later. And then 8 days later, ice appears again and melts away. You have this incredible log of the appearance and disappearance of ice, the freezing and thawing of the coastline. But no real statistical work, no serious work could be done with the data because of its inconsistency and incompleteness. So no conclusions were drawn from it, right? And this is the kind of thing that goes on throughout the 19th century. Another thing that happens in the 19th century is that steam travel becomes incredibly important and incredibly popular. Goods are traveling on steamships, and people are traveling on steamships. Pleasure cruises become a thing, right? At the turn of the 20th century, there's just a massive expansion of merchant shipping, which means that the stakes of the game in terms of safe navigation of open water, the stakes are changing. They're going way up. And in 1910, there's a controversy in the United States over who should create and publish weather maps of the seas. It's just a hilarious kind of battle between the U.S. Weather Bureau and the Hydrographic Office of the Navy. And these two entities kind of just like duke it out over who has the right to make weather charts that would enable safe navigation. The Weather Bureau insists that only its meteorologists could be trusted with the investigation of weather conditions. And the Hydrographic Office counters that accurate pilot charts were essential to safe navigation and, quote, too many lives and too much treasure is dependent upon such charts to entrust their preparation to a bureau which is not supposed to know about navigation and the dangers of the seas, and which was founded for the purpose of supplying information about the weather to the farmers of the country, end quote. It's like this withering kind of critique, right, of the Weather Bureau. So they kind of duke this out. The Hydrographic Office does its best to produce as many pilot charts as it possibly can. And it's pulling in new readings of soundings. Soundings are really important to understanding how ships can navigate. So they're receiving all of these new reports of soundings. They have thousands of volunteer observers spread out all over, providing, updates when they feel like it on obstacles to navigation, from wind to waves, icebergs, storms, all of it. The other mode of collection of data used at the time was the use of bottles, of glass bottles, which would be turned adrift. And the whole world of seafarers would watch out for them and collect them and return them and gather information about currents. It's just wild to think about how people are trying to study these things at the time. But one of the key moments, right, a key turning point in all of this history comes in 1912 with the sinking of the Titanic, the shipwreck to end all shipwrecks, right? The Titanic sinks after hitting an iceberg. And this is a massive wake-up call to the international community. And in 1913, an international ice patrol was established and essentially headed by the United States. So Coast Guard ships patrolled throughout the entire ice season, which ranged from March to July. And their job was to chart the movement of what they described as ice which menaces steamship traffic. So there were two cutters, naval cutters, Coast Guard cutters, They were outfitted in Halifax, and they steamed along the coast of Greenland through Baffin Bay. And one glacier on the west coast of Greenland was actually known to calve an iceberg every single day, right? So these are zones of really high ice productive activity, right? Some of the icebergs would stay in their home latitudes, some would eddy, some would drift south, and those that went southeast posed the greatest danger to steamship travel. So the patrol ships would follow them. They were outfitted with men who would sketch and photograph the icebergs and document them, measure them, so that they could be identified later. So the patrol ships also received constant reports from any vessels sailing through the ice region. The ships were supposed to submit every 4 hours reports on water temperatures as well as their ship location. So just think about, this is a massive amount of data constantly compiled into twice daily reports on the ice danger in the Arctic. So this is how people are trying to safeguard steamship travel in the early part of the 19th century. And all of it was held together essentially by one man. In the early 1920s, a man named Lieutenant Smith spent the entirety of each ice season at sea. An individual cutter would only go out for 15 days at a time, and Lieutenant Smith would go out on the cutter, and when the other one came to relieve it, he would basically jump from one ship to the other ship and just stay out for the entire ice season. And so this one man single-handedly knew the locations and movements of all menacing icebergs. He could identify them all himself. it's just kind of a wild thing to think about this single man who's kind of styles himself as the protector, the man who can prevent catastrophic sinking of a passenger cruiser, right? Meanwhile, back at the hydrographic office, they, in a sense, have an even more difficult task because they're not just tracking ice and icebergs. They're supposed to be taking into account the changing conditions on the world's oceans, right? All of them. So they need to be able to inform any kind of vessel or aircraft, wherever it has to go, about what conditions it isn't going to face when it gets there. So mariners, again, they need information about routes, winds, currents, fog, ice, coastlines, port facilities. It's a huge, huge task. And it required money. So one of the interesting documents that I came across is a statement of a congressional hearing given in 1920 by the hydrographer of the U.S. Navy, a man named Captain Washington, who goes to Washington and gives a report to a committee explaining the inner workings of the hydrographic office and essentially begging for an infusion of cash. The hydrographic office, their main problem was that they were still purchasing thousands of charts from the British Admiralty, as everyone had always been doing. The hydrographic office essentially would purchase the Admiralty charts and copy them and distribute them, but they didn't necessarily have the capacity to make their own plates. That was much more intensive, much more work-intensive process and required more money. This became a real problem. It had always worked okay, right, up till this point, but in 1920, the British Admiralty issued an announcement that they would no longer be selling charts to anyone but Portugal, Italy, and oddly Russia. So all of a sudden, the U.S. Navy realizes that they have a serious problem. If they need to send their fleet somewhere in the world where they don't already have a British Admiralty chart, they're up the creek, right? So this is a problem. Captain Washington tries to get the Congress to make a massive appropriation. They're sympathetic, but it doesn't happen. Time goes by, decades pass. And the next real turning point in the history of navigational mapping comes with the bombing of Pearl Harbor, right? That changed everything. All of a sudden, the demand for pilot charts, for navigational charts, it just skyrocketed. The U.S. Navy needed to be able to send large numbers of ships all throughout the Pacific Ocean. They could not be dependent on a poor or inconsistent supply of charts. And so all of a sudden, the hydrographic office is kind of swimming in resources. They put out, at one point at the peak in World War II, they put out a staggering 43 million charts in a single year, right? They recruit the best geographers, the best cartographers, and of course there's infighting between the civilian and the military surveyors and map makers about who really understands what, but they get the job done. And over the course of World War II, in addition, among those 43 million charts, one of the signature projects of the naval mapping industry, if you want to call it that, was led by a man named John Weaver, Dr. John Weaver. He was a geographer. He's known in the world of geography as the guy who basically wrote the book on agricultural geography. His book was about barley production in the American Midwest, which has nothing to do with ice and nothing to do with the Black Sea. But in 1940, Dr. Weaver was working for the American Geographical Society. And in 1942, he was eventually transferred to the State Department. And then he spent 2 years, 1944 to 46, working as an Arctic intelligence officer with the U.S. Navy. And for that whole span of time, 1940 to 1946, he was obsessed with ice. He became the editor, the compiler and editor. He led the team that produced something called the Ice Atlas of the Northern Hemisphere. And the Ice Atlas of the Northern Hemisphere, published in 1946 by the Hydrographic Office of the U.S. Navy, is the atlas that includes the ice charts of the Black Sea, right? So this atlas, it's gigantic. Every single one of the maps is 2 feet by 2 feet. So if you open up the atlas completely, it's 2 feet tall by 4 feet wide, right? It's gigantic. It's sold for $8 a copy. And it was notable. It's absolutely aesthetically gorgeous, right? But it is important for a couple of reasons. It classified ice. It kind of introduced a completely new classification of ice. It classified all of the ice in the northern hemisphere, right, from the Arctic all the way down to the Black Sea, into categories based on the permanence and the navigability of the ice. So is it navigable at all? Can you crush it with an icebreaker? Or, is it just seasonal? And even if you have a relatively normal boat, maybe you can get through it. So he has this classification of ice that's very different. He's very concerned with navigability, not necessarily with anything else. He also moves away from the practice of mapping averages of the amount of ice you would find in any place, or the average day when ice would melt. And he moves instead to mapping extremes, the extreme limits of ice. And the idea here is that averages aren't so useful if you're a mariner and you're on the wrong side of the average. It's much more useful to know what's the worst it could possibly be, right? What's the extreme limit of the presence of ice in the region where I'm sailing? So it was a massively successful atlas. It was used in the field. It was edited and reissued. And it's an amazing thing. But the thing that fascinates me about this ice atlas of the Northern Hemisphere from 1946 is that it has a bibliography that runs to about 2,000 items. And a lot of them are studies of ice published by the Soviet Union, particularly in the 1930s. Records for Russian Arctic ice go back to the 18th century for sure, 18th and 19th century, but they are inconsistent. But regular Soviet reconnaissance flights began in 1924, and they picked up dramatically in the 1930s. U.S. Arctic reconnaissance flights really didn't start until the 1950s. But by 1950, right, think about it this way. This ice atlas represents a really important moment in the history of maritime and climate science because it's published in the brief moment in between World War II and the outbreak of the Cold War. Let's call it 1949, right, with the foundation of NATO. So, yeah, the US and the Soviet militaries have been producing classified information for 20 years at this point, right? They're both systematically doing it from the 1930s to the 1950s. They aren't necessarily sharing all of it, but they were in communication and they were publishing some of it. And everything changes at the start of the Cold War. I don't want to overstate the case that this atlas represents some sort of like hunky-dory, happy, unhindered flow of information across scientific communities, but it's definitely true that things change in 1950. Information sharing ceases, and we enter an era of conflict rather than cooperation. Now, we come to the end of the story. Interestingly enough, one of the very first major initiatives to launch in the wake of the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 was the Environmental Working Group, which was essentially spurred by Al Gore. It opened in 1995, and the whole goal of this thing was to share and release previously covert scientific data about the Arctic, about ice. And the Russians and the Americans were going to do this together, and they did. Now, that project produced some of the best data, historical data we have for understanding climate science out there. And you can currently access it from the name of the agency is escaping me right now, but you can get it through NOAA, and I'll follow up. But the Black Sea was not part of that project. The Black Sea was no Arctic, right? It's always been an important site of commercial maritime activity, which is why Dr. John Weaver was interested in ice in the Black Sea. Just think about the shipments of grain that fell victim to Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, right? But the inclusion of the Black Sea ice charts, right, in the 1946 atlas, that reminds us that climate and weather patterns, river courses, sea coasts, these things define human geography, right? Our ability to move across space, perhaps even more powerfully than political borders do. According to John Weaver and his team, ice was a menace on the Black Sea. Sure, it was occasional, unpredictable, it was very poorly documented. There were no glaciers calving icebergs into the Black Sea, right? But there was danger in the sea, and maps were the mariners' best protection. You can go see for yourself, right? Search up the David Rumsey Historical Map Collection and plug in Ice Atlas of the Northern Hemisphere into the search tool. You will find it. You can page through it. You can get up close and personal with it. Have fun thinking about flows of information across time and space. And we'll see you in 2 weeks for the next installment of Degrees, Minutes, Seconds. Bye, everyone.